Hi, and welcome to the second lecture on civil rights about school desegregation. First, in response to a question from the last lecture, there was a series of statues at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, that group that I linked on the Edmodo page, showing women, enslaved and chained up with their infants, which, that was an accurate representation of how things went. So pretty grim. But moving on to desegregation. You guys remember the founding of the NAACP by W.B. Du Bois and others in the, I think, the early 1900s, very early. It was, probably the most important civil rights organization by the 1950s. And it was represented in court by Thurgood Marshall. Importantly, as we go through this, through this unit, there's going to be a lot of tension and disagreement between various civil rights groups. So keep that in mind. Sometimes the history of civil rights gets kind of flattened out to not include that, but it's one of the more kind of interesting and meaningful aspects of the civil rights struggle is kind of how tactics, priorities, and strategies were debated among the proponents of civil rights themselves. So turning to the Supreme Court, during and after World War II, there are a series of cases that kind of start to push back against the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, but they don't quite face it head on. You don't need to remember all of these names. This is a lot. But you should definitely know the issues involved with these Supreme Court cases. First of all, the kind of striking down of all-white primary elections is important because most of the South was basically a one-party state. The Democrats had a lock on the South, so if the Democratic Party is a private organization that has rules making its primary elections all white, then that basically gives black or other non-white people, voters, nowhere to kind of affect the political process. So that was really important. There are other things. The striking down of state enforcement of restrictive covenants was important, but it doesn't necessarily get rid of restrictive covenants or somehow magically racially integrate neighborhoods. De facto segregation is going to be, in a lot of ways, harder to attack than de jure segregation. And finally, in the Sweat v. Painter case, the court is starting to tiptoe up to the idea that separate and equal on its face is unconstitutional, but it's not quite there yet. In Sweat v. Painter, it's still saying that separate is okay as long as equal exists. But it's going to take Brown v. Board to take the next step. And that happens over a series of actually two cases rather than one case. In 54 and 55, the actual case of Brown v. Board 1 is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of different cases brought by black families throughout the country that are combined into one kind of example case. And one of the cases actually comes from South Carolina. Not Brown v. Board, but another one. And you guys are going to read in homework in a couple of days about the court's kind of new understanding that the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling and the idea of separate but equal facilities is inherently built-in impossible, because separation is by its very nature kind of against the idea of equality. And it was very important that it was a 9-0 decision, because that shows the court speaking with kind of great force on an issue, which, especially when it's going to be hard to enforce is important, and we'll talk about the difficulties with enforcement in just a moment. One of the main difficulties, a lot of people would argue, came from kind of the follow-up to Brown v. Board, which is called Brown 2. Again, you'll read about this in a future homework, but a lot of people argue that the Warren Court gave southern states too much leeway to kind of to desegregate on their own terms. The phrase is "with all deliberate speed," as opposed to saying specifically when southern school systems have to desegregate. So various kind of important players here. Eisenhower, if you remember, is seems to be not necessarily personally especially racist, but just for him, civil rights are not an important priority. And in some places, federal courts will kind of try to enforce the ruling of Brown v. Board and later rulings that supported it, but it's not going to be the case through much of the South. And in fact, even though we think of Brown v. Board as integrating school systems in 1954, 1955, it doesn't happen in a lot of cases until decades later. A lot of the white South pushes back strongly and successfully against the Brown decision, and that includes our own Senator Strom Thurmond. The idea of massive resistance had worked in the past. One of the ways that this was seen in places like Columbia was the opening up of private schools that were still segregated, but using public money to fund them. So a fun trick you can do to find out which private schools in Columbia were started as white flat academies is to look at the founding date of them. And if it's sometime around now, it was probably started in order to get around Brown v. Board. The citizens' councils are going to be important parts of the civil rights struggle. That is the struggle against civil rights. And we'll run into them repeatedly throughout this unit. One of the most famous crises in school desegregation happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. And there's a video that I'm going to ask you guys to watch that will get into this a lot. It's a really an important story with a lot of lessons for. Maybe one of the most important takeaways from Little Rock was the idea that proponents of civil rights needed the use of force by the federal government, but that was unlikely to come if civil rights proponents couldn't kind of rally the national mood in favor of federal intervention. So that's where the moral narrative and the use of television as a medium became more important. And that is all for now.